Now this is a neat little trick that will help you easily get your springs in or out of any Sprite, Midget or Austin A35, anything with this suspension. Now it's a clever little trick. Probably anyone who's been playing with Sprites for a long time will know this, but I didn't know the trick till I got this car, so it astonished me. First thing I will say though, if you're playing around with springs, springs are dangerous. This is a store of energy and it only needs to be compressed a very tiny amount to have a lot of energy in it. So if that all comes out really quickly, this thing can very easily bounce out and kill you. So if you're in any doubt as to whether you have the competence to be playing around with springs, don't do it. And obviously you've got to do your own kind of due diligence to work out what you've got to do. I won't be held responsible if you do what I say in this film and you kill yourself. But basically, rather than using a conventional spring hanger, these springs, they go up through the middle of the wishbone and they're held in place by this little plate that sits under the spring. There we are. And that's held into the bottom of the wishbone with these 4 little bolts. So the trick is basically one by one, take these bolts out of the plate and replace them with longer bolts. So these studs are about 5 inches, 13, 14 centimeters long. Now if you use studding, make sure one end the nuts are locked, because if while you're doing it the nut pops off unexpectedly, as I said before, the whole thing could spring out. This little thing will go flying and it could be curtains. But basically once you've replaced all the 4 bolts with these long bolts done up basically tightly, I mean not really tight but just kind of tight enough to stop it jumping out, once it's in place you then grease the thread of your studding and wind it down bolt by bolt equally, slowly, and then this plate under here will decompress slowly, or actually recompress. I'm just putting this one in now, but that's how I got them out, until eventually there's absolutely no play or no pressure on the plate at all. You can undo the bolts with your fingers and lift the thing out. So as I say, even when it's nearly there, don't underestimate, never stop respecting your spring. I mean on the good side, the way it goes up through the wishbone means it's pretty well protected and it's unlikely to jump out. But as I say, still be very careful, but a neat little trick all the same, and it does make changing the springs on these cars pretty straightforward. That's in place. Wash on, and then a nut, there's one that will hold it, diagonally opposite, down to the hole, washer. Now you can probably see I've got a little bit of spare thread sticking out. You want to make sure you've got enough thread, especially when you're taking the springs out. That's probably the most dangerous time. So as you're winding this down, if you get to the end of the stud and the spring is still under any tension at all, wind it all back up, bolt it back together and get some longer bolts. You want to actually have it kind of finger tight like this, where you can actually rattle the thing around with still kind of, you know, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch of stud on the end, and that means there's no risk of your nut coming off the end, because even if there's still 1/2 inch in that spring, you know, finger compression. It doesn't even feel that much. That will fire a nut off the end of there like a bullet, and that will obviously do an awful lot of damage. And if the spring itself actually is to be released and come out, as I say, always respect the spring. That thing will kill you if you're not careful. Now just another thing, you probably want a little smear of grease on the studs before you start, but then wipe it all off again so that the grease is just in the threads. But then while you do the winding, you want to smear grease all over the stud. I made the mistake first time I did it of covering the thing in grease before I wound it up. This was while the springs were still in place, and there's an awful lot of winding you've got to do with that nut up about sort of 5 inches of thread, and that's actually a bloody nightmare when it's all covered in grease. So it's much easier to kind of wind the nut up while the thread is dry. You can spin it up finger tight, and then kind of make sure that the thread is properly greased before you start winding down. You do have to grease it, otherwise the nut and the thread will chew itself to pieces, which also is a potential danger. You know, if the thread itself gives way, everything can go pear-shaped. But as long as you basically follow it, there we are. It's pretty straightforward. And the only other thing I'd say is before you actually wind it all up, make sure everything's straight and square, and watch it as it goes up. There we are. That's it. Oops. And then once it's all in situ, you simply take these studs out one at a time and pop back in the proper little bolts. Do those up nice and tight, and then before you leave it, make sure everything is straight and as it should be. And then good uncle, that's your springs changed. There we are. So you can see they've got 4 studs on now, so I'm winding that up finger tight before I start. Wind them up as far as I can. Now I am going to grease this up before I get going, but just to show you what I'm doing, I'll start with it dry. Here's a little tip. Once it's under pressure, the studs will stay in the same place. I basically use a socket, and I've put some insulating tape around the socket, just makes it easier to grip. Oh, so wrong way, 1/2 inch. And you can then wind that up. And as it goes up the thread, if you don't actually use a ratchet in it, the stud will actually come out the back hole, so you can go all the way up finger tight. But then I use mole grips on there. That's the reason I put the tape on at an angle, which then allows the stud to come through the hole, and you can wind it round and round and round. But at an angle you can also avoid the other stud, so it just makes the winding much easier. But remember, do it symmetrically, a couple of turns on each bolt and go round. You don't want one tighter than the other. Keep it nice and even as you go up. But then once you've got it right near the top, you will have to use proper spanners to tighten it up. But yeah, it's a fairly straightforward job. Look at that. That's just makes it much easier than fiddling around with the nuts. And as you can probably see, that is now actually under a bit of pressure, that spring. Just finger tight. You can actually go a long way just to kind of using your finger on a socket, a couple of turns per corner. There we are. And you can see there I'm leveling it up a bit. So yeah, that spring, you can hear, is now under tension. That is now dangerous, even though I've only just put a couple of winds on with my finger. Yeah, there is enough energy in there to do an awful lot of damage to a person or to your stuff. So from here on in, just be careful. And that's basically it. So that's now up tight, all four are in. I've actually got to wind them out now. I'm doing it one at a time. And just pop the regular bolts back in. So it just shouldn't take long to spin that out. Now, because I know these are the right length, I'm actually going to keep these studs now in a little pack, just in case I have to do this job again in the toolkit. My Sprite spring removal set. Bolt. I should just drop it to the top. The back one's a little bit fiddly. That's it. Got the right washers on it. There, that's it. So I can do that one up properly tight now. Lovely. So I'm going to tighten that one up before I do anything else. That's tight. So that's all the studs done. Just finally tightening up here. So here you probably can't see too well, but here is the existing front suspension. That is actually Jago. So that's Jago's wheels, Jago's suspension, Jago's brakes. It's got disc brakes at the moment. So that's got to go back. I've got to pull the front suspension off, the brakes off. It's got disc brakes at the moment. But this is what I've got to replace it, a complete early Sprite suspension setup, all together with drum brakes, which is actually what this car would have had originally. Much less effective than the discs, but also much cheaper. So I managed to get this at a really good price, and it has already been rebuilt. It was actually rebuilt about 25 years ago and set aside. So it's got new kingpins, new bushes. It's actually in pretty good shape and ready to go. So I'm going to whack that one. But yeah, that is quite a lot of the car really kind of turned over.